So finally, I would like to talk about intelligence and what I think intelligence is. Because sometimes people have arguments where they go, oh, you're just not being rational. But what does rational mean? You're not being logical. Well, if you study logic in maths or philosophy, you discover that logic starts with some assumptions and then you deduce things from those assumptions. And if you just start with you have to start with some assumptions, otherwise you can't get anywhere. So sometimes people say if you're using assumptions, then that means you're not being logical. That's not true. But also, if you only use those assumptions, then that's not exactly illogical. You just haven't got very far with your logic. So some people say that they don't believe in gay marriage because they think that marriage is between a man and a woman, which sounds logical, but all they've actually done is said the same thing twice. So there may be other ways of defending that position, but that isn't a very good one. But it's not illogical. So if I say, I like this table because I like this table, that is logical. It's just not very helpful. It's not very productive. And so that being logical is not the be-all and end-all of intelligence, I think. So I thought about it, and because I'm doing all these diagrams of interconnectedness, I try to distill what I think intelligence is about. And I think it's about being reasonable, being not just logical, but powerfully logical, by which I mean that you're able to make very long chains of deductions, both forwards and backwards. So you don't just say, I like this table because I like this table. That's not a long chain of deductions. But if you can unpack a very, very long way why something is happening, which is what mathematicians do all the time because we're trying to trace things back to their first principles, that's, I think, powerful logic, where you actually get somewhere. So the last thing I think is that to be intelligent, you should really be helpful. Because if you just sit around making logical deductions that don't help anybody, I don't think that's very intelligent. We can argue about that, but that's what I think. And so then what does reasonable mean? And what do all these things mean? I thought, well, what I think reasonable means is that not only do you use logic, but you have some kind of framework for testing yourself. And this is a really important aspect of the scientific method and mathematical theories, that it's not just that we have a theory and we think it's true. There is a very clear framework for when it is not true. And if somebody wants to say it's not true, there's a clear framework for how they do that, and there's a clear framework for when we should agree. So if they find a mistake in our proof, then it doesn't actually mean the end result isn't true unless they can find a counterexample. It might mean that our argument isn't very solid. With scientific theories, sometimes people say, oh, scientific theories are just theories. It's just some kind of statistical certainty about things. But the point is that there is also a framework for telling when you're wrong. So there is a framework for deciding when you're fairly sure about something, and there is a framework for telling you're wrong. And that makes it different from someone who says, I just don't think the moon landings happened. That's my theory. It's as good as a scientific theory, because they have no framework for admitting when they could be wrong. There's no amount of evidence that would convince them. They would think the entire thing was fabricated. So if there is no possible framework for someone admitting they're wrong, then it's not really a framework. And I would say they're not being reasonable in the sense that one cannot reason with them. So being powerfully logical, I think, is about not just using logic, but having techniques that you've developed for using logic that help you get further, such as seeing things in an interconnected way, pivoting between situations. I also spend a lot of time in the book talking about gray areas and how we should deal with those because they're very difficult. Being able to see many different causes of something, being able to have ways of unpacking things back and back and back. And finally, how are you helpful? Well, I think that to be helpful, you need to have techniques for being helpful, but very importantly, you need to be able to engage emotions. Because being helpful, I'm talking about helping other people. And if we don't engage our emotions, then we can't be helpful to other people in as much as we could if we do engage emotions.